The GovX Show is supported by Forrester, helping government organisations perform at their best. Visit forrester.com to learn more.
Hello again. Welcome to another episode of the GovX Show. I'm Tim Coulthard, Community Director here at GovX Digital. Delighted to say that joining me today is Christina Butterfield, who is the Head of Public Sector Advisory at the citizen experience software experts Qualtrics. We're going to be exploring how citizen experience design and transformation can really drive new levels of capability and performance in the public sector. Better outcomes for citizens, better outcomes for users, better outcomes for employees as well. So we're going to explore what these concepts mean, how to get them right, where public sector can often go wrong when trying to make the best of them. Loads to get into, so let's jump right into that conversation now. So Christina, welcome to the GovX Show. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here.
Good stuff, and looking forward to getting into talking around an interesting topic around experience-driven transformation. Lots of terms flying around in the public sector about the users and voice of the customer and stuff, but really keen to unpack what it for you and for Qualtrics, what that means and how you're helping the public sector sort of navigate through those waters. So looking forward to diving into that really interesting topic because as you say, it's hot right now, and so we want to understand how to do it well and what it means and all that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe let's set the scene to start with. So can you just tell us a bit about you and your role, and particularly how you're working with public sector organizations at the moment?
Yeah, sounds good. So essentially, I'm a public sector industry advisor for Qualtrics. I'm not sure how much you know Qualtrics, Tim, but essentially Qualtrics is a software management company that does experience management. So what we basically do is we help our public sector organizations to collect feedback across citizens, across patients, across employees, bring that together in a central system, use analytics to actually understand what is actually driving that feedback they're receiving, and then critically actually take action on the back of that. So as part of my role, what I actually do is I work with those organizations to help them essentially stand up those programs and to actually mature the existing programs that they already have in place.
Yeah. Okay. And it's interesting because, you know, we can all probably remember maybe the bad old days where public consultation and voice of the user was maybe like some drafty hall where you could come and look at planning applications and that sort of stuff. And so I guess with digital and technology, we've now got this possibility to do these really rich dives into understanding sort of real-time data and real-time feedback, as opposed to this sort of, you know, I'll fill a form in and thanks very much kind of thing. So I'm excited to hear how the world's kind of moving on and what good might look like in that space. So great to hear what it is as an overview. So let's start like good academics. Let's start to understand our terms, shall we? Because I think, as I said, terms like citizen experience, user-centered design, they trip off the tongue very nicely. And there's some great work being done out there, but then there's also times where I think we need to understand what it really means and how to incorporate it into our organizations. So the term that we're exploring is this experience-driven transformation. So what does that mean to you? What's that for a public sector organization?
You know, it's funny that you mentioned like those days where you'd have like those focus groups or those dusty old halls. So I actually started my career in things like community consultation. Gotcha. So I was typically the person with the clipboard at like a ferry terminal asking whether or not we wanted to move the ferry terminal or we're happy with it being there. So it's quite interesting that you talk about that. But what I would say is, yes, the world of experience management and citizen experience has come a long way from those days when I started my career, probably like 10, 15 years ago. So simply put, what I would say is experience-driven transformation is really about the collection of citizen insights and employee insights as well across all of those interactions and those journeys with citizens and employees. It's basically about bringing that together within a central location and being able to actually understand what are some of those insights actually telling us from an organizational perspective. So what are those holistic insights actually telling us some of the issues in terms of the citizen or employee experience we're delivering? And critically, where can we actually make some strategic decisions or transformation on the back of that? So that those strategic decisions or transformation could be everything from, say, operating model improvements. It could be things like essentially like new service designs, new channels to actually deliver a better citizen experience, and essentially could be operational improvements too.
Okay, and interesting, you mentioned employees as well, and I think potentially that's something that gets overlooked in this whole thing. You know, we talk about users, and so the perception is end users, citizens, people out in the public, but systems are also used internally as well, and so that employee piece, you know, has to play through. A couple of questions around that. Is that a bit of a blind spot for some organizations in terms of that employee engagement and that employee understanding? And if they're not making a good job of that, what are they missing out on in terms of systems, operations, whatever it might be?
Yeah, so if you think, I mean, excellent point, Tim. If you think about employees, essentially employees are a true representation of your citizen experience. They're the ones who are driving your culture and driving your interactions with your citizens and your residents. So they need to be satisfied. What we typically find, and there are so many research studies that support this, is we typically find a more satisfied employee is actually going to deliver a better citizen or customer experience. The happier they are, the better that experience tends to be for a citizen. What we also find is frontline employees are actually an excellent source in terms of understanding what actually isn't working in terms of channels or service design. So if you think about it, they're really hearing about customer problems day in, day out. They're the ones dealing with those challenges. They're the ones who see the key themes coming in from citizens or residents or patients for that matter. And what they're able to do is basically say, actually, it doesn't really make sense that we do this process, or wouldn't it be better if we improve this particular content on a website to actually enable people to understand what they should be doing upfront rather than having to call us to resolve that issue. So that's typically why when we are talking to our customers about designing citizen experience programs, we are also making sure they are incorporating that employee experience piece, particularly around frontline experience. So as an example, we worked with one of the public sector organizations over here, and what they were finding as they were setting up their Voice of the Customer program or Voice of the Citizen program is they were finding that their frontline employees had like a wealth of insight into what wasn't working in the process, what wasn't working in terms of those channels that were being provided to citizens. They actually stood up using Qualtrics and our view capability within the organization, which basically enabled frontline employees to provide feedback continuously around where those improvements could be made. And that enabled them to, I think, last I checked, they had managed to save about $500,000 in terms of savings around things like making improvements to channels, reducing that cost to serve, addressing issues the first time they came into the organization. So it can be very powerful capturing that employee experience alongside that citizen experience as well.
Yeah, sounds like it. I mean, am I right in thinking it's a blind spot, or actually we're getting better at it? I know it's a big space, the public sector, but are we doing a good job? What do you think?
What I would say is, I think a lot of us are talking about it. I think there is acknowledgement that it needs to happen. So we run a lot of like independent employee experience programs as well as citizen experience programs. And what we are finding is where we do the citizen experience piece, but we're not actually looking at that. Where we do the employee experience piece, but we're not actually working with the citizen experience teams yet. We do actually find those employee experience teams are already thinking and talking about actually, how can we join these two together? Because we know that we need to understand, and it's helpful for them, right? Because the better the citizen experience is, the more value, obviously, the employee experience, that gets more attention, and there's more value and investment in that particular area. Because if you can provide a linkage between employee experience and citizen experience, reducing things like cost to serve, then that is a very kind of meaningful conversation that you can have as an organization. You get additional investment in employees.
Yeah. So I'm totally bought into the ethos and the sort of drivers for this. You can, of course, see the logic. So when you start to get into the doing a little bit, what are the points for a public sector organization, for example, where what's of value? We talk about this in data as well, right? You know, people say, "Oh, just collect data and then see what you can do with it later." And it's like, well, you know, you need to be engaging with your users or citizens in a way that they don't feel like you're constantly badgering them or harvesting information that they don't think you need. So, in terms of those data points, and I've seen references to the term signals as well. What is worth collecting? What should organizations be trying to capture? and then what should they just kind of leave out there because it's not worth the effort, or it's not worth the sort of loss of engagement to grab it?
So it's interesting you mentioned about the whole ethos around just collecting as much data as possible and seeing essentially what insights you can gather out of that. Typically what we refer to lots of public sector organizations as is data rich and insights poor. They just have so much data. They really don't understand exactly what in that data should be driving action on the back of it. But in terms of what they should be thinking about doing and what types of data they should be collecting, I'm going to throw some terms out at you, but I'll clarify exactly what they mean as I go
I'll look
through.
blankly back at you and you can
Yeah,
help.
no, you're all good. So there's really two areas. One is around like solicited feedback. So being able to capture solicited and structured feedback. What I mean by solicited and structured feedback, that's your traditional survey feedback, right? And that's typically things around like customer effort and customer satisfaction. So when something is, say, someone is engaging with a service as an example, and you'll basically ask them, okay, how good was that interaction that you had? Did it answer your questions, etc.? And that gives you an idea based on solicited feedback from the citizen, how effective that particular process was. We don't think that you should necessarily stop there though. Where our more mature customers are actually moving is they're actually moving to the unstructured and unsolicited data piece. So what I mean by that is if you think about all interactions with a public sector organization, every day they're probably getting millions of interactions via their email, via voice, and via chat, right? Calls to their contact center. If you were able to actually use machine learning and AI to understand the sentiment, some of the key trends, the customer feelings across all of that data you already have, you can actually start to pull out richer trends, and you can start to supplement that solicited feedback with that unsolicited data piece. So you can start to build a true picture, both across solicited and unsolicited, of actually what's going on in the organization. What we tend to find that addresses the issue around like survey fatigue and addresses the issue around low response rates as well. So being able to basically think about those two different types of data collection and stand up essentially programs that do both of those, build a richer picture for an organization. What I would say is most public sector customers, they do the solicited data piece well. I'm sure you're aware of how many surveys you get based on interacting with government services. Not as many are doing that unsolicited piece. So I definitely think that's where public sector organizations need to be moving, and these types of programs need to be going.
That's really interesting. And yeah, seeing how the evolving technology in terms, like say, like AI, machine learning. So how close are we with that kind of stuff in terms of the potential, the technology being there, and then the adoption, and then is there another phase to follow? You know, what's over the horizon?
Yeah, so what I would say is that technology exists. So from a Qualtrics perspective, of course, I'm going to mention Qualtrics and our capabilities. We actually acquired a company called Clarabridge that is one of the leaders in that particular type of listening. So we've already had a lot of interest from our existing customers in actually supplementing their existing survey programs or solicited feedback programs to actually start to do that piece of work. What I would say is from a public sector perspective, we're probably still not quite as mature to do that. I definitely think there's a bit of groundwork that needs to happen in order for organizations to be able to do that. And that's like organizational groundwork and work around like the existing data systems that they have in place already. There is a piece of work that needs to happen to actually bring together all of the existing insights programs. Because as you can imagine, what we typically find is different service lines and different channels tend to have different approaches for how they're collecting citizen experience. Actually bringing that all together, having that wealth of information in a single place is really critical to be able to then mature your program. If you don't do that, you will really struggle to create a really mature program that gives you those holistic insights you actually need to actually take action.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm asking you questions about the public sector like it's a thing, like it's, you know, it's this one. It's, you know, there are, you know, London boroughs have 600 business lines going on, right? So the idea that, oh yeah, what is the public sector doing with this? You know, I appreciate there's a kind of massive caveat there, but it's interesting to hear what the potential is. And I guess sometimes you say AI to someone in sort of public sector digital, and there's both a longing and a reticence, because AI carries all this kind of associated people project all kinds of things about, assumptions and algorithms and things sitting in the background. So leading it through and getting that sort of implementation and getting, I think when the public hear AI, they think, okay, they're coming for our brains, So I think it's interesting to hear. It's interesting to hear that actually it's a very practical, a very practical way to use this and break that
exactly
barrier.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to use AI than have one person trawling through millions of different emails, etc.
That would probably be not much fun.
Exactly.
And I'm interested about there's the technology side of it, and then as everyone always says, technology and systems are one thing, but if you can't make use of them, you can't make them work as an organization, it's pointless. It's just expensive kit sitting there doing nothing. So in that sort of cultural piece for a public sector organization, and again, they're all different, but what kind of cultural traits make this work in terms of how they can become, whether it's like a listening organization, what's a successful recipe that you've seen?
I think there's probably 4 things in that. They need to have a culture of feedback. They need to empower teams within the organization to actually be able to make changes on the back of that feedback as well. Critically, they need senior leadership buy-in and the right level of senior leadership buy-in, and then it's communication as well. So what I would say around the first piece is basically what we do sometimes tend to find is we tend to find that sometimes voice of the citizen programs are, or user research or user experience programs, they're often owned within an individual silo or department within an organization. So it might be a customer insights function, it might be a customer experience or citizen experience function, or a customer services function. What I would say is actually those insights need to be shared across the broader organization. They shouldn't just be housed and owned by a single area. But in order for them to be essentially owned by the entire organization, there does need to be an open culture of feedback. So the organization needs to be open to hearing where they could make improvements and prepared to take action on the back of that. One way we actually find that action piece working is by empowering actual individual teams with the right insights for them to be able to go and take that action themselves. So typically the way we do that is we set up what we call like role-based dashboards. So based on a specific team, they would have the KPIs that are relevant to them, the experience data that's relevant to them. Those dashboards would be available in near real time, so constantly updated. So they could always see at any point in time how they're tracking in terms of performance and experience insights. And then they should be empowered to be able to take that action on their own. Obviously, making sure that's fed up into a broader program, but you do need to make sure your teams are empowered to actually do that and they feel like they own that process as well. What I would also say is senior leadership buy-in, as you can imagine, is critical to that. It's probably one of the biggest things that we see. The programs that are very successful and very bought into in our public sector organizations are those programs that have a senior enough individual who is completely on board in terms of citizen insights, collection of citizen insights, and understands the value of like taking actions and making improvements. For the programs that are more immature and are taking longer to get off the ground, typically we do see that there is a continued issue around senior leadership buy-in that is essentially holding them back. And then the final thing I would say is communication. You do need to make sure you are communicating your successes, you're communicating the types of insights you're getting, you're communicating the improvements that are being taken across the organization, not just within, say, a customer services or customer insights team.
Yeah, that I've heard it said before that if like for CX, for example, if an organization thinks CX is the responsibility of everyone just with the job title of CX in it, then you're going to have a problem, right? It's this pull through the whole piece. I'm interested in I guess as a companion to that cultural aspect, which is the sort of operational technical side of the organization, whether that's how it's structured or what systems and processes. Without wanting to sort of drag you into some sort of IT chat about what's needed, are there any common threads there that in terms of the way the organization's positioned in terms of its ops and its systems and stuff that make them more capable of making a success of this kind of listening and transformation?
Yeah, so I think it's the classic things that you typically see with these types of programs. There is a bit around processes, there's a piece around governance. So you do need to make sure you have well-defined processes when you are setting up these types of programs or when you have one of these programs in place. So as an example, if you are expecting teams to be able to go and take action, you need to be clear on where that ownership sits, what the timeframes are for that action taking to actually happen, and what the process is for them to actually take that action is as well. So that's something you need to sort out up front, or if you haven't sorted that out up front, that's something you definitely need to address now, sooner rather than later. The other piece is governance. So governance is obviously critical to these types of programs. As I mentioned, it needs to be a governance structure that sits across the organization, not within a specific team. What we do actually find with our public sector organizations, because they have so many different governance forums that already exist, they quite often just use an existing one, which makes total sense. It's a great way to essentially stand up a governance framework without having to go through the arduous process of adding to an already complex governance model. So they just use existing forums, which makes total sense. And then at a certain point in time, they might mature to having a specific governance forum for this piece of work. So that's something else that they need to make sure is critical, and they do need representation across the entire organization. And the individuals on that forum need to be senior enough to be able to make decisions. Then the other piece I would say from a technical perspective, so obviously it's about having that single experience management solution. We spoke before about bringing in all of your data and bringing it together within a single system. That is essential. Ideally within that solution, you should have a solution that has that inbuilt analytics function. So you're not having to manually do those processes or use different systems to do that. So ideally you want that in one system. Something else you want to be able to do is manage actions. So you want a solution that can actually do that action management and notification system for you. Ideally, it's a solution that you should be able to integrate with a lot of your back office systems. Yes. So you should be able to pull your operational data into that system as well, not just your experience data, because then you're just adding to your tech stack another system that just does one thing. That's the challenge. Around that actions piece as well, what I would say is you need to think about how you can automate some of those workflows to take action. So as an example, if you had a piece of feedback, say about the website, you don't want someone sitting there having to then filter that to the right team. Actually use the technology to automate that workflow on your behalf, so it goes to that team and that action is resolved a lot faster. It sounds like a lot, but really that starting point is bringing everything together into a single system. And then you can think about actually, how can I mature this model moving forward?
Okay, great. So, right, let's say we've got all this in place now. We've got the systems, we've got the culture. What does good look like in terms of this experience-driven transformation? You know, what are some examples that we might share with the audience to inspire them to really kind of meet this challenge and take advantage of the opportunity in the public sector? What could we, how can we inspire them to go out there and make this stuff happen? What's good examples?
Yeah, so what I would say is I think the UK government is on its way to delivering experience-driven transformation. I know the GovX event we were at a couple of weeks ago, we heard from lots of organizations who were talking about it. They were bought into the process. I would say they're not quite there yet, a lot of them, in terms of actually being able to deliver it in like a programmatic cross-institutional organizational way. So there are still steps that they need to take. I do think they can learn lessons from around the globe though. So we actually work with an organization in Australia called Service New South Wales. Not sure if you've ever heard of them, but no. So basically what they are is they're the Department of Customer Services for the state of New South Wales. So any interaction you need to have with a government service in the state of New South Wales needs to go through Service New South Wales. So they manage all of the contact centers, they manage all of the digital channels, and they manage all of the face-to-face service centers as well. So what they have actually done is they've used Qualtrics and they've stood up an experience management team. And critically, experience management is citizen as well as employee. So they've done that piece, they're bringing those two together. And what they've actually done is they've stood up listening across each of their, sorry, I'm going to cough. Sorry, they've basically stood up listening across their citizen and employee journey. So all of those moments that matter and points in that employee and experience and citizen journey, they actually collect insights as part of that. What that has enabled them to do is actually it means that they have a wealth of information that they can use to understand where there are gaps in their service delivery, where there are potential channels that they need to spin up, where they can make improvements to those channels. And this really came to life in probably the past year with various issues and incidents that were happening in the state of New South Wales. So the bushfires that were happening in the state of New South Wales, what this team was actually able to do is they were able to spin up an instance of Qualtrics to basically understand from those people who were affected by the bushfires what support they needed, what programs that could be supported, basically set up to support them. And then they could actually filter those people to the right services that were already available to them. So they're aware of what support was needed when they actually needed that. They did a very similar thing around COVID as well, where basically they understood what impacts it was having on different people in the society, so businesses, individuals, and were able to actually think about what programs and support they could provide to them and what channels were needed to deliver that as well. So I think Service New South Wales is definitely one lots of UK government organisations could actually learn from. What I would also say is, I think my one takeaway from today's conversation is experience management is not something that organisations should be thinking about as an afterthought. It's really something they should be thinking about as part of their overall operating model. It's something they should be thinking about as much as like enabling technology, their culture, their people, their processes. And if they start thinking about it in that way, they will really start to drive some real value in their organization and be able to have continuous improvement in their organization as well.
Fantastic. What a summary. I mean, I think, you absolutely summed it up. It's been brilliant to explore the kind of the start to finish of what experience-driven transformation is, and a compelling reason to do it as well, as if it's the cherry on top. So really enjoyed the conversation, Christina. You've opened my eyes to what this actually looks like. As I said, lots of terms flying around, lots of sort of hot button topics. So to understand what that is and how it can work in the public sector has been really interesting. So all I'm going to say now is thank you for joining me and for sharing those insights.
Thank you, Tim. It's been great to be here.
So thanks again to Christina for joining me for that conversation. Really enjoyed unpacking that experience-driven transformation concept. What is it? How do we get good at it? What ingredients and signals go into the mix? How can we unlock the potential of our own employees in terms of the insights that they hold from their own interactions with users? Loads of stuff there, so really practical takeaways for everybody watching. I'd also recommend you check out the on-demand session Managing Channel Shift, which took place at the Citizen Experience Show recently. I'll put the link in the show notes and you can enjoy that at your leisure, and also learn from the Intellectual Property Office, HMRC and Ofsted, as well as Christina's perspective from Qualtrics. Loads to unpack there as well, so do check that one out. That's about it for us for another episode, but I'll be back soon with another conversation with a public sector changemaker. Until then, goodbye.